All right, the clock says 1:35 on my watch. So good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Talent Acquisition and DEI. It's a perfect match. I am Jordan Harder from the Department of Administrative Services, Office of DEI. I'll be moderating this session and watching the chat for questions. Just a couple of announcements before we begin. First, we invite you to submit questions or comments in the meeting chat. The presenters will do their best to address these at the end of the session. Second, this session is being recorded and may be posted online or made available for on-demand access. This session will be presented by Benjamin Fournier and Destiny Davis, State Talent Acquisition Team Managers at the State Human Resource Division, Department of Administrative Services. And now, please welcome Benji and Destiny.
Thanks so much, Jordan. I popped my camera on. I don't know if that works in this function or not, but for anyone that I've not yet met, my name is Destiny Davis. I'm on the State Talent Acquisition team, of course, and Benji is here with us as well as the rest of my team from OTM. We're so excited that you guys are joining us this afternoon, and I know we are right after lunch, right? So we have worked really hard to make this a fun theme throughout the presentation. We have a lot of engagement, so we'll be asking you guys to periodically throw things in chat. Feel free to use your reactions on the Teams, which is located at the top bar here. And then we'll also be using something called Slido throughout the presentation. So if you are familiar with that, you know you can use your phones. You can have your phone near you. If you're not familiar with that, don't worry. We're going to talk you through how it works and how to use it. But it's just a really good way to keep everyone engaged and hear from our audience, which we love to do here at Talent Acquisition. And then at the end, if we have enough time, we are planning to open it up for a little bit of networking. Our talent acquisition team loves networking opportunities because we can share ideas with each other. And of course, we'll answer any questions at the end of the presentation. So thank you again all for joining. And we're excited to talk to you guys about talent acquisition and DEI being a perfect match. So today we're going to be talking about a perfect match. Let me go ahead and share my screen here. All right, and if I can just get a thumbs up that everyone can see my screen. Oh, actually, let me make sure I shared audio as well. Give me just 1 second here. All right, now you should all be able to see my screen, and we do have a little video, so I want to make sure later you're able to hear my audio. I see some thumbs up. Thank you guys so much. So like I already told you, today we're talking about talent acquisition and DEI being a perfect match. So we're going to be talking about a couple of different things today. We're going to talk about inclusive hiring. We're going to talk about labor markets, dating. How fun is that? And hopefully by the end of this presentation, we will have convinced you that talent acquisition and DE&I are a perfect match for each other. So why are we talking about this? Well, we tend to recruit people who are the most like us, or we tend to hire the same types of people. In other words, we tend to fall into a comfortable pattern, and that's really an unconscious bias that does not belong anywhere near recruitment. And in fact, studies have shown us that that can be detrimental to the future of organizations. So our goal today is to convince you that it's a perfect pairing with talent acquisition and DE&I, and hopefully you'll leave here today with some new ideas to employ an inclusive hiring strategy. So let's jump right in. First up, we are going to use Slido. So if you're familiar, go ahead and get your phones out. You can point your camera at the QR code here. If you're not using a smartphone, you can use a web browser, and you'll just go to slido.com, and then you'll type in this hashtag 1263190 number, and that should bring you up to our polling questions. Now, we aren't presenting a live poll currently, so don't panic if you see that no poll is currently being displayed. We'll get there. I'm going to give everyone a quick minute here just to get signed into that, to make sure it's working. If you can give me thumbs up once you are into Slido. Donna, I see your question here. So are you guys seeing the screen okay? The Slido code is 1263190. I'm seeing some thumbs up. Thank you. Much appreciated. I'm seeing all good in the chat. We'll give it just a few more seconds here to make sure everyone has the opportunity to join. And we'll use this throughout the presentation, so you can keep it up. You don't need to close out of it. Keep your phone by you. And we'll have the code on various slides throughout this presentation. So if you accidentally close out of it, don't panic. We'll get you back in, no problem. All right, I'm seeing a lot of thumbs up, so I'm going to go ahead and open up the first audience poll. So, who's joining us today? We want to know, are you a state of Ohio employee, general public, other? Feel free to drop that in the chat. We're so excited that everyone's here with us. We have a huge crowd, but this really helps us know who's with us, and we have a couple of internal examples we'll be using, so that helps us to know how much we need to explain around that. I see we have a ton of state of Ohio employees. Hey, Team Ohio, thanks for joining today. And we have a couple of others. HR employee, awesome. And then not too many from the general public, which is okay. We're so excited to have everyone here with us. And I see we've gotten about 61 responses. We'll give that a few more seconds, and then we're going to jump right in. Franklin County Child Support, wonderful. All right, so we have about 64 responses. If you didn't get a chance to answer here, don't worry, you're going to have more opportunities. Moving right along to our next Slido poll. What are the greatest matches in history? And Brownie points to the first person to say PB&J, but it does not have to be food related. It can be not food related. It can be people. It can be anything that you think, two things, I guess, that go together really well, complement one another, or just really belong together. Taco Tuesday, absolutely. I love that. Peas and carrots. Okay. Donnie and Marie, I love it. OSU versus Michigan. Burger and fries. Man, you guys must be so hungry. Oh, chocolate and peanut butter. I have you hungry after lunch here, huh? Salt and pepper. Absolutely. Oh, this is so cool. I see so many answers just pouring in. Saturdays and Sundays. I'm going to challenge you that it's Saturday, Sunday, and Mondays, right? We love those long weekends. Those should just happen more often. I see we have more people typing, and you can throw multiple answers in. Don't feel limited to just one. Batman and Robin. Oh, that's such a great mashup. Classic. DE&I and talent acquisition. Someone here is paying attention. You're doing your homework. You understood the assignment. Excellent. HGTV and knitting. I love that. Ross and Rachel, Friends fans on the call. Much appreciated. Man, you guys are on fire. You thought of way more than I ever did. Now, wait a minute. I see one that says perfect weather in Ohio, and that one I don't know about. We might have to challenge that. We get a lot of snow here, so I guess it's going to depend on your definition of perfect weather, right? Taco Tuesday is a big one. I completely agree. I love my Taco Tuesdays. This is awesome. So we've gotten about 33 responses and counting. I'm going to give you guys, let's say 10 seconds to get your last thoughts in here, and then we're going to move right along. You guys are so creative. I love it. Thank you for bringing all of your energy to this session. We're going to need it to get through this 2 p.m. feeling, right? I see a lot of great things on here, but I am going to convince all of you by the end of this presentation that the greatest match in history, possibly ever, is talent acquisition and diversity, equity, and inclusion. They just belong together. So before we jump into that, let's talk about candidate pools, right? Do we have anyone in here that's in talent acquisition space? I know we had one. You can use your reactions, raise your hands, just be sure to put them back down. If you are, you have probably been feeling a little bit like this, maybe when you are trying to find the perfect match, right? Or maybe raise your hand again if you feel like this, right? You know the fish are out there and you're dedicated. Look, this guy has his lunch and he's casting his reel, but the fish are just not buying it. They are like, no way, we're not falling for that. I'm seeing some hands. Yeah, candidate pools have been really dry. Not a lot of fish in the sea lately. Or maybe you finally get the right fish, or AKA the right candidate, and then this happens. They've accepted the offer, and then at the last minute they decide not to start. A lot like this guy losing his fish to a bird. After all the work he probably did to get it, right? Yes, yes, awesome. Thank you. If you have your hand raised, feel free to put it down. You have more opportunity to use those reactions throughout the presentation. And I think that this idea really drives home the fact that recruitment can be a lot like fishing, minus cargo shorts and cold beer, of course. For any of you avid fishermen out there, you know those things are perfect matches as well. Because first, you really have to have the knowledge, the insight, and the patience to understand what it is exactly your hiring manager is looking for in a perfect fish, aka perfect candidate. And then you have to find the right fishing spot and you have to dangle the right bait to catch the right fish, like, say, an inclusive hiring strategy, but we'll get there. And then you can reel in that perfect fish or candidate, right? And we also know that it's currently a candidate driven market, right? So you've probably heard that before, but what does that actually mean? A candidate driven market means that there are more vacancies than there are people looking to fill them. In fact, according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, the fill rate is the lowest that it's ever been at 60%. What does that mean? What's the fill rate? Let's back up. So, for every 10 jobs, only 6 of those jobs are getting filled. That's not great. And as a result of that, we have the market that is highly competitive with companies who are battling to attract and recruit the best candidates, aka fish, that are out there, right? And we know the research and the data is telling us that inclusive hiring strategies can increase our candidate pools. So instead of this guy with a bird or the guy with the no fish, hopefully, instead, we can end up like this gentleman who is having the best of luck and reeling in fish after fish, and they are just waiting to jump on his hook, right? So now we understand what's happening in our candidate pools. Let's look at our labor market to really understand why our candidate pools have no fish in the sea. So in the chat, go ahead and throw in what is happening in our labor market. You've heard some things, you've seen something, maybe you've read an article, maybe you've experienced it directly. I want to hear from you guys. What do you think is happening in our current labor market? I'm going to give you guys about a minute or so here. Any guesses? I don't see anything in the chat. Do we have any guesses out there? Okay, competition. Thank you. Lots of employees moving to different jobs, a mismatch between desired skills and the candidates, salary demands. We all know that's true, Adrian. Other options? Yeah, absolutely. Other options before the traditional 9 to 5. I know the UK is doing like that 4-day work week now, which is awesome, in my opinion. More flexibility, telework, in person, union salary. Yeah, absolutely. A lot of changes, right? You guys are on fire. So, yeah, I think you guys are spot on. We've had 14 years of economic growth that was disrupted by the pandemic, right? So, we know we've heard, at least, we've heard about the great resignation or the great reshuffling, whatever we're calling it in today's world. Essentially, people are leaving the labor market, right? And currently, the labor participation rate is at a mere 62.3%. So that's not great. But wait, what is the labor participation rate and why do we care about it in talent acquisition? Well, a labor participation rate really means that if you were in a room with, say, 10 people and you asked the entire room, hey, who wants to work? About 4 of those people would sit down because they are not interested. And a lot of research is leaning to point to the fact that childcare has become a critical issue for many of these employees in the high demand jobs. And then, in addition to that, we have an ever increasingly tight labor market, and we have an unemployment rate of, any guesses in the chat before I give you the answer? Does anyone know what the current unemployment rate is? Yeah, 3.5%. And why does that matter? Why do we care about unemployment rate and talent acquisition? Well, an ideal unemployment rate is somewhere, there's no magic number, but somewhere between 4 and 6%. When our unemployment rate is too low, that means that recruitment and retention will suffer because there's less candidates in the pool and less qualified candidates in that pool. In addition to that, we experience higher turnover because employees have really the option of employers. They can pick and choose, they can go back and forth wherever they can get the highest salary or sign on bonus or whatever spiff we're coming up with. Organizations are competing for the same people, and really the employees have the upper hand here. And then factor in the fact that 4.5 million people are quitting or switching jobs every single month. In addition to that, around 28 million people retired during the COVID-19 pandemic, mostly baby boomers. So we know we're on the brink of a baby boomer retirement, right? And when you add to the fact that we also are experiencing a low birth rate. So you've heard of the baby boomers, you've probably also heard of the baby bust, right? People aren't having kids. So that's not great when you consider that the number of jobs are increasing. Organizations are growing and expanding, and they need to hire that talent. So that puts us in the midst of what's being deemed the war on talent. So, with all of this happening in our labor market, how do we match with our candidates? I already told you that recruiting is a lot like fishing, right? But it's also a lot like dating when you think about it. And this is kind of a fun theme, so I hope you guys will enjoy it and roll with us here. But if you think about it, the labor market is constantly changing. Just like how dating has changed from back in the day, you would ask somebody out in person, you would go on dates in person, you would meet somebody in person. But now we have online dating, right? We have Tinder, we have Plenty of Fish, whatever app you want to choose. And now, just like dating, but also in recruitment, before somebody expresses interest in you in the dating world, they're going to research you. They're going to go to your Tinder profile. They're going to read your social media. They're going to see what you're all about before they actually match or express any interest in you. And candidates are doing the exact same thing with potential employers. So while you're considering how to best put yourself out there, AKA building your dating slash employer profile, it's really intentional to be um, intentional and think about that inclusive hiring when you're doing your matchmaking strategy, when you're thinking about how you want to represent yourself to candidates. And similar to dating and recruitment, just like in the dating world, in life, when you date the wrong person, you waste a lot of time and energy, right? We've all been there. And in recruitment, when you hire the wrong person or the wrong candidate, you have the cost of turnover and wasted time and wasted energy. So that's something we have to factor in, right? The cost of turnover is not cheap. And we know that new talent is not considered an asset if employees are not productive or if they choose to separate from our agency or organization within the first year of hire. So I'm talking about cost of turnover. I told you it's more expensive, but what actually is the cost of turnover? There's a lot of studies about this. And according to the inclusion dividend, the loss of an employee for one employee is estimated to be somewhere between 1/3 of the annual salary and up to 2.5 times the annual salary. So if you think about that for a minute and you have a position that pays, say, 50K a year, you could be looking at a high end of $125,000 in turnover cost. What does that include? That includes acquisition cost, your job posting. Did you have to hire a headhunter? All of these things that fold into talent acquisition. In addition to training, you have lost productivity, you have a cultural impact on your organization, your department, benefits cost, training and onboarding cost, and then you think about the fact that you're not only experiencing that cost of turnover when the position's open, but you're also experiencing it when that employee is onboarding, right? Because we know from research and data that says employees are not actually fully productive for their first year of employment at a new organization. So that's a lot, right? I'm giving you guys a lot of information. So let me add to that by telling you that we have also seen in research that when workplaces in environments are more welcoming and more inclusive, they can employ greater retention rates and better workplace cultures. And there's a lot of studies around this. One was done by the Level the Playing Field Institute, and they did this huge study of 1,700 leaders who voluntarily left their employer, and they found that 34% of people of color would have stayed if they had a more inclusive team. And let me circle back and tell you that the estimated amount of money that they were losing because of turnovers, and that's going to be organizations within the United States, is around $60 billion per year. In the tech industry, they've attributed $16 billion annually because of workplace culture turnover. And in another public case done by Nextel, they were actually able to directly link a 2% decrease in turnover to diversity and inclusion training. In other words, by having more diversity and inclusion training, they were able to decrease their turnover by 2%. That's pretty substantial when you think about it, right? Because as I mentioned, turnover is not cheap. So with all of that in mind, let's go back to what I said about our matchmaking profile. Intro our talent acquisition dating profile. And here we are, here's our profile. We want to find our perfect match and put our best foot forward and tell everyone what we're all about, right? So they know, so they want to match with us. But we already know it's a tough market. We already know our candidate pools are dry. So before we can find a perfect match, we need to understand our workforce. Just like in dating, before you can get back out there or get in the dating world, you have to understand the dating world. What are people looking for? What are people doing? What's cool? What's not cool? So let's look at that. Let's get a better idea of what's happening in our workforce. So think about our workforce and what it currently looks like. For the first time in history, we have 5 generations in the workforce. Who are they? Currently, 2% of our workforce are traditionalist. 25% of them are baby boomers. That's a quarter of our workforce, by the way. That's a large amount. And consider I just told you how many of them are retiring, right? So that's not great. Then we have Gen X making up a whopping 33%. We have our millennials. I'll raise my hand here, 35%. And these years that you're seeing at the bottom, those are your birth rates. So if you were born between 1925 and 1945, you're considered a traditionalist, so on and so forth. And finally, we have our newest generation, Gen Z. And that brings us up to a birth rate of 2020, making up 5% of our current workforce. Now stop and think about that. Because if you were born in what, say 2004, you're probably 18. So you may be entering the workforce. So we know that Gen Z will continue to enter the workforce and this number will grow and grow. Our workforce is comprised of people from between 1945, which was the end of World War II, and 2004, the launch of Facebook. When you think about how very different those times are and how unique each of these generations and people within these generations must be, their unique perspective, life experiences, employer preferences, values, communication styles, employer expectations. I mean, I could go on, but wow, that's a big difference, right? So let's dig into this a little bit more to better understand our workforce, to better understand what it is that makes them them and some common themes among them. Full disclaimer before I start, these are intended to be general common themes among generations, and they may not be true for every person within that generation. Please use caution to not make assumptions about people. And with further ado, we'll start with our traditionalist. So our traditionalists, they make up 2% of the current workforce. They're commonly described as loyal, dependable. They prefer written communication to email. They tend to be a more go with the grain type. So think obedience over individualism, age is your seniority. They look for stability. And that's interesting when we consider how the workforce has evolved, right? Because before, many years ago, we would see people staying with one company for 10, 20 plus years. And now, according to SHRM, the average tenure is just 1.5 years to stay with an organization. That is not very long. That's a huge shift, right? Then we have our baby boomers, right? 25% currently today. And as I mentioned earlier, we're on the brink of the baby boomer retirement. However, 65% of them are expected to work past retirement age, and 10,000 of those baby boomers reach retirement age every single day for the next 10 years. That's a lot, right? They are considered to be workaholics. They have a strong sense of duty. And this really resonates when you think of some of the shift we're seeing currently in the workplace, calling out burnout culture, right? So people used to work long hours, they worked weekends, and now you see people calling that out. I saw in the chats earlier, we were talking about that, right? The UK has 4-day work weeks now. So we're seeing that shift. However, this generation does tend to be flexible with communication style, phone, text, email, and they work best when given a specific goal or a deadline. Bring in Generation X, 33% currently of our workforce, but they're going to outnumber baby boomers in just 6 years. That is not very long. And that's really interesting because we start to see this continuation of a shift towards work-life balance. They're very protective of their personal life, which is very different from the 2 generations that we just looked at. We also start to see this preference for diversity and not really being afraid to move on from an employer if they make changes that impact them personally or in their personal life. And that's also very different, right? They're not as loyal to the organization as the past 2 generations. So this is kind of the opposite of the side we just talked about. And then we bring in our millennials, 35% of the current workforce. However, in just 3 years, they will make up 75% of our workforce. Let that soak in. We see a real focus again on individuality, diversity, work life balance, and again, that job movement if they don't buy into the changes an organization is making. And finally, we have our last generation, Gen Z, 5% currently. And what we're seeing so far is this major shift, embracing where they're even demanding diversity, individuality. We know this group is proficient in emerging technologies, right? Our IT generation. And this generation is going to continue to grow in the workforce. And they are really commanding organizations to shift and spotlight a focus on diversity. And for those who don't, focus on that diversity, the employees have already demonstrated for the last 2 or 3 generations that they are quick to leave. They are not loyal to an organization for things that they do not agree with. So I want to hear from you guys in the chat. What do you think? Does this hold true for you? Do you see similarities, differences? Do you feel like this is pretty accurate? This was a study done by Purdue Global, and I think it's really interesting. Donna is saying less focused equals just young. I think that's a really interesting perspective. Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, I'm seeing some of us do agree, and there might be some differences. Again, this isn't true for everyone within a generation, so please keep that in mind. But now we know who is in our workforce today, and we know some key information about them. But what do we do with that? Right? Keep in mind that this is going to keep changing. It's going to keep evolving. It won't be the same in 2 years, 5 years, 10 years from now. So, how do we use this data in our hiring process or business as a whole? With so much happening in our ever changing labor market and our workforce, how does an organization keep up? How do businesses make themselves more appealing to the current and future workforce? Well, if the answer was easy, we would probably all be doing it already, right? So maybe we don't have all the answers, but we do have some of them. So let's take a look. What we do know, what research is telling us, and the data is supporting, is that organizations who leverage an inclusive hiring strategy benefit from broader talent pools, higher innovation and productivity, better retention, better culture, customer satisfaction, and positive brand image. So, what is an inclusive hiring strategy? An inclusive hiring strategy is recognizing individualism. It's about looking at the candidate as a whole of what their unique life experience brings to an organization. The goal of an inclusive hiring strategy is to level the playing field while fighting against hiring bias and discrimination, which, by the way, will cost your agency or organization a lot of money, right? We probably already know that. It's really important to differentiate what an inclusive hiring strategy is not, and that it is not just recruiting people from underrepresented backgrounds or disabilities. And it's really important to keep that in your mind because a lot of people tend to get stuck around that idea or the mentality of this box checking, right? And in fact, we've seen in recent times in pop culture and in research telling us that employees and potential employees can often spot when an organization is engaging in box checking mentality. A really good example of this is in recent times, many of you probably saw the call out of rainbow washing during Pride Month. So we know that candidates are doing their due diligence. They're doing their homework to see what an organization is all about. They care about the values of an organization. And diversity, equity, and inclusion really need to be a core value of the organization, not just employed during the hiring process. That's a great start, but it needs to be an integral part of building an inclusive work environment to really reap the benefits of an inclusive hiring strategy and an inclusive culture. So I've given you guys a lot of information and I'm going to throw another statistic at you. So data also tells us that 4 out of 5 people, 86% of our workforce, believe that DE&I in the workplace is important to them. Which means if you're not making DEI important a priority at your organization, you're literally pushing away 86% of the workforce towards another employer who is making it a priority, who is internalizing those values, right? Food for thought. A lot of people struggle with equity, and so we're going to talk about that in the next slide as well. But essentially, equity is about leveling the playing field for equitable opportunities for everyone and to create a sense of inclusivity and belonging, right? And actually, the state of Ohio has a vision to advance equity with the intent to be a model for justice, equity, opportunity, and resilience to withstand those future challenges. And what does that mean exactly, right? So we're going to explore that in the next slide. But first, let's check out our DEI dating profile. So DE&I is searching for someone that they really are looking for someone who can embrace all of these ideas, right? So this is their little dating profile. And let's learn a little bit more about equity. So many of you have probably seen the equity tree. I think this is such a great image to bring home equity, which is often confused with equality. So for those of you not familiar, in this image, let's talk about what we see. First, in the left-hand top corner, we see inequality. That's really easy to pick out, right? One guy or person or girl has all the access to the apples, the other person not getting any. Equality then evenly distributes the tools to the ladders in this picture. However, we see one person still cannot reach the apples. What's going on here? Equity is custom tools that identify and address the inequality. So, a taller ladder for the shorter person, and they can now reach the apples that they have access to. Whereas justice in the bottom right corner is about fixing the system and offering equal access to both tools and opportunities. So here we see the tree is not tilted anymore, it's been fixed. We have the same tools, and now we have even disbursement of those apples, aka opportunities, so that both people have access to them. So that's really what equity is about. And I already mentioned that Ohio has this vision to advance equity, right? A great way to work towards this, and we're going to talk about this more, is by reconsidering screening factors and requirements. And I'll mention this a few times, like I said, but essentially, it's important to keep in mind that sourcing for attributes in talent acquisition that are maybe broader or more comprehensive than your traditional keywords will help you find candidates that no one else is finding. It's an untapped market. Updating what you're screening regularly for is also crucial to keeping diverse candidates in the talent pool. And this really means making room for marginalized races, veterans, people with disabilities, marginalized genders, and other underrepresented groups throughout your HR searches. It's really important to avoid any screening factors that aren't 100% necessary to perform the job so that all of the qualified candidates feel comfortable applying. And we're going to come back to that idea. But first, I want to do a recap. I've given you guys so much information. We've talked about our diverse workforce, we've talked about labor markets, and we've talked about DE&I. So hopefully by now you guys are already feeling the chemistry between talent acquisition and DE&I. Let's take a look. So, how do we translate all of this into the workplace, right? By using an inclusive hiring strategy, that is such an impactful way to partner talent acquisition and DE&I together at the very start of an interaction that a candidate has with an organization. Intro the super like. Some of you may be familiar with that. If you're not, I'll let you Google it on your own. But it's essentially a great way to match two people in the online dating world, from what I understand. So, using an inclusive hiring practice is also going to help you build a long term inclusive culture and work environment. So, we know that we want to get these two together. And Jordan, I see the recording has stopped. So, I just wanted to bring that to your attention just in case. We should still be recording. But we know that we want to get them together. So, how do we set up talent acquisition and DE&I? I mentioned reconsidering requirements earlier. Well, here's a great real world example of Team Ohio and how these ideas or concepts can come together to make our hiring process a little more inclusive. And I think that this really highlights the idea of reconsidering your requirements to be more inclusive. So, if you're a state of Ohio employee, you probably know we use minimum qualifications and equivalency statements, aka ways to meet those minimum qualifications. And our Department of Natural Resources made a classification amendment last year to their officer classification, and they included this equivalency statement for military service. So that's a really great way to just be a little bit more inclusive in your requirements and screening process within talent acquisition. So, how do we build an inclusive hiring strategy? We've talked a lot about it, right? First of all, it starts with the recruitment process where talent acquisition comes in. You have your job posting, your screening and interviewing stage, and your hiring and onboarding stage. So we've seen the TA part, right? This is the talent acquisition side. It's pretty standard. We're all familiar with it, hopefully. And if you're not, that's okay because we're going to talk about it. So how do we leverage DEI in each area of our hiring process? At a high level, here are some broad ways to fold DE&I into the aspect of the hiring process. For job postings, you can have more inclusive language, and we'll talk about what that means and what that looks like in the next slide. For example, you can also have outcome-based essential functions, and that's important. That it's not just job postings that you want to use inclusive language in, but it should also be your job descriptions, your application, your careers website. There's so many different places where you can use inclusive language. So keep that in the back of your mind. In the screening and interview process, we can become more inclusive by eliminating bias, which is huge. It has such a huge impact. We can also ensure an accessible interview or screening process. And finally, we have hiring and onboarding, right? Our favorite part, if we can just get there, right? We can get the right candidates. And we can really improve this area of our hiring process by better understanding reasonable accommodations and recognizing them, and creating a safe space for psychological safety and inclusiveness from the very first day. And I heard somebody mention safety earlier. So, safety can be psychological or physical. You need both to really have an effective work environment. So, that's an important call out. And by really making this more inclusive from the very first day throughout the hiring process, because we all know onboarding goes well beyond the first week, right? This is just the beginning of fostering an inclusive work environment. And we're going to talk about all of these areas within the talent acquisition space and how to incorporate DEI into each of them in more depth. So, first off, we're going to start with job postings. Now, I'll give you guys a few minutes. I won't read this whole picture chart list to you, whatever you want to call it. But this is how we can make job postings more inclusive by using that inclusive language. So the image on the right is like a quick cheat sheet of some language that you may consider to its traditional wording. So using inclusive language means things like leaving out gender-based words. If you don't know what a gender-based word is, you can do a Google search for it. For example, outspoken, the word outspoken is often male coded because we oftentimes associate men to be outspoken, whereas the word interpersonal is typically female coded, right? We typically attribute that to a female to be more interpersonal, more interactive, chatty, whatever you want to call it. So these really simple words have some depth behind them and some implicit bias that you want to think through when you're thinking about the language you're using in all of these different postings, descriptions, website, whatever it is. A few other ways that you can include um, a more inclusive job posting is using short sentences and brief paragraphs. And you can also do this by, instead of using like the italics and underlining words, you can instead use larger font and embolden words you want to highlight for candidates who may have, say, a visual impairment or dyslexia. So keeping things in the back of our mind about these things are really important when you're just doing that initial beginning really of the hiring process. And remember that you're using these inclusive language throughout all materials, not just on your job postings. What about essential functions? I alluded to that earlier. So what is an essential function? An essential function is essentially a basic work task that's critical duties of a specific job. An employee has to be able to provide this. Title I of the ADA requires qualified individuals with disabilities to be able to perform these essential functions with or without reasonable accommodation. So that's really important information. And we know that supervisors often have a role in determining or reviewing those essential functions. So knowing how essential functions apply to individuals with disabilities can actually help supervisors write them more accurately. It's really important to know how these work tasks can often be performed in more than one way, right? There's more than one way to do most things. So, to support this, these essential functions should be written based on the outcome, so outcome driven, of the task instead of the customary method that's used to typically traditionally perform that task. So, that's a lot. That might be hard to understand. Let's look at an example. I'll give you guys a few seconds here. Ultimately, what they're saying in this example is instead of using that traditional language, the essential function of lifting and carrying 40 pounds, you may consider stating an essential function as move and transport. That's the outcome, right? The outcome isn't to lift and carry, it's to move and transport these 40-pound whatever. And the reason that you might consider that language is because maybe it's possible for a person with a physical disability to achieve an outcome of the essential function in a different way. So, for this example, maybe they can use a lifting device and a cart on wheels to move and transport them. Another example of essential functions and inclusive language is phrases like strong English language skills. So that has implicit bias, right? Because that's probably going to deter a qualified non native English speaker from applying. They may not feel comfortable applying when, in fact, they may be very well qualified and may exceed the threshold of what's considered strong English language skills. So these are things I want you guys to keep in the back of your mind. Carefully reconsider your screening requirements. This can also include removing a degree or licensure requirements where they're not absolutely essential. So, another thought on this idea, Is it really necessary for someone to have a driver's license when they just need to get to a location? Or would we consider them having reliable transportation to the location as an acceptable option? Say they're using public transportation, or say they're Ubering, what have you. As long as it's reliable and they can get there, that's the outcome, right? Some additional ways that you can have inclusive job postings and make the most of your job postings are making sure that you have an accessible careers website, using ADA and EEO statements on all your postings. Team Ohio, these are in your templates that we have already. So you can look for those if you want some ideas around that. Some other accessibility standards that you should implement include using transcripts and closed captions for video and audio files if you're including those on your job postings or descriptions, and also alternate text for images, and then color contrast standards for people who may be colorblind. You can also consider posting on diversity specific job boards, groups, or sometimes they have different networks that you can post on or spread word through. By tapping into your employee referrals of your diverse employee networks, you can really get that word of mouth out there to deeper candidate pools as well. Now, disclaimer, that will only work when there is psychological safety and trust. So you have to really work on building that before you explore that avenue. But it can be really successful. And I've seen that personally throughout my time in talent acquisition. So those are all great ways to leverage diversity, equity, and inclusion in job postings. Moving right along. The screening and interview phase. So what can we do in screening and interviewing to be more inclusive? I already told you eliminating bias is so important. It's critical. And there's actually a couple of different ways to do this. So first and foremost, you can establish a diverse interview panel. And when you're doing that, you should also provide training for your interview panel or those involved in the hiring process. That can include unconscious bias training, disability etiquette and awareness training, um, and make sure you're consistently using the same interview questions, panel, and scoring guide for each applicant. I know we use standardized interviews often. I'm not sure if everyone does, but if you don't, it's definitely something you should be doing to be more inclusive and to eliminate that bias. You should also make sure that you are communicating inclusively in all of your correspondences. So if you're sending a correspondence, you want to let the candidate know what environment they might be interviewing in. Is it virtual? Is it physical built? And if it is physical built, what does that space look like? Because that might prompt them to ask for a reasonable accommodation. So keep that in mind as well. And also, when you're using testing or screening as part of your hiring process, it's really important to make sure that you're evaluating that data to check that you're having an equitable hiring practice. And finally, certainly my favorite of all of these is using a blind process. If you are a part of Team Ohio, our Taleo system is capable, and we're going to talk about that. But first, I want to give you guys some more context about what a blind hiring process is for anyone who may not be familiar. I have a really neat video that our LTD team shared with us. So I'm hoping technology is on my side when I launch this, and then you're all going to be able to hear this. Give me 1 second.
I looked at my path.
If you guys can give me a thumbs up that you
My
can hear
path
this,
is
that would be
designed
tremendous.
for those.
Could we have candidate number 5, please?
Can we see this? Thumbs up? Okay, perfect. So I'm going to go ahead and play this for you guys. It's just a few minutes.
For instance, male conductors of orchestras have long believed that men are inherently better musicians than women.
We'd like to start with excerpt number 2.
And so, even after women finally got the chance to audition, men continued to win almost every open position in the world's orchestras.
The paradox of these biases is, of course, that the conductor or the selector is not trying to pick the least good person. The conductor is trying to pick the very best person. New York wants the very best violinist before some other city can steal that person away.
Could we have candidate number 6?
But it turns out that even though you as the conductor want the very best person to be the one that you select for your symphony, that you actually are quite willing to give up the better woman for the more mediocre man because you've seen their gender. And that's what's getting in the way, rather than what you believe you're choosing on, which is the music. So they began to do blind auditions where they dropped a curtain between the player and the selectors. And the reason symphony orchestras are well known to us is because scientists have shown that they changed a lot faster than many other industries did. Over a 15 or 20-year period, American symphonies went from being almost entirely male, with the one little harp player maybe in the corner doing her thing, to all of a sudden becoming deeply gender integrated. So this is at once shocking and very pleasing. Shocking that it took something like a curtain to actually take away the offending data that were otherwise getting in the way of selecting the best musicians. And then, of course, there's happy outcome that with such a simple device like dropping a curtain, symphony orchestras began to pick better musicians. And I wish to emphasize that. Many people say to me, oh, it allowed women to enter the orchestra. But let's for a moment not care about that. Let's just care about the quality of what we're producing. The reason the blind audition is so great is not because it let women in, but because it let better musicians in, whatever their gender.
Create a professional
So
logo.
I hope you guys enjoyed that video. I think it does a really great job of just showcasing the benefits of a blind hiring process, and we can easily relate that to talent acquisition. Let me just get set back up here. Perfect. So moving right along, and we'll talk about the blind process on this next slide. So before I jump in, PII, personally identifiable information. Any guesses what that actually includes? Any ideas of what that might include when you're thinking about a talent acquisition process? Date of birth, yeah, absolutely. Gender, race. You guys are on it, yeah. So PII actually includes all of these things, and I won't read you the list. You can read the list yourself. But we know that removing PII from an application before a hiring manager sees it is proven to reduce bias. According to a study by NeoGov 2021 diversity study, when using a blind screening process compared to those not using one, Black females were 33% more likely to be hired. And as I mentioned, blind screening is available within our Taleo Recruit system for State of Ohio employees. You can email Recruit Onboard for more information. I know Benji will throw that in the chat, but we're always happy to talk about the blind screening process, and we have a lot of agencies already using that. So definitely consider it if you're not. When you have talent acquisition plus diversity, equity, and inclusion, what do we get? From a business perspective, we have inclusive hiring practices that provide so many advantages. Not only is it the legal responsibility of the employer to consider every candidate equally, but it's also the organization's reputation and brand image at stake. So we know that inclusive hiring practices strengthen company reputation, which attracts talent in a competitive market that we're obviously in. Research has shown us that having diverse talent on board leads to higher levels of productivity, innovation, and performance. It also helps to improve employee retention rates, which is going to further promote the positive brand image of your organization. So to bring it home, I want you guys to know that talent acquisition and DE&I is a relationship that you should always swipe right on and super like. They are, in fact, a power couple. And in today's market, you need an inclusive hiring strategy. It's critical in obtaining that top talent. So Jesse Jackson once said, and I'll leave you with this, is when everyone is included, everyone wins. So before we open it up to questions, we do have a little bit of time left. I'd like to unmute the audience and hear if anyone has any best practices where maybe talent acquisition and DE&I have come to fruition. It can be something you're doing, something you saw somebody else do. We'd love to hear from you. And if nobody is brave enough to share, then we'll open it up for questions. Jordan, I'm not sure if people are able to unmute themselves with this format. I'm going to defer to you and the experts here. If not, we could do chat. That would work as well.
Yep, we are unable to unmute. So if anyone posts a message in the chat, I will read it out.
Awesome. So if you
Got
want to
about-
share a best practice or if you have questions, go ahead and chat them. While we're waiting on questions to pop into chat, I'll go ahead and throw up our QR code for our State of Ohio LinkedIn. If you're not following us, we'd love for you to. We throw out some great content on there. And thank you guys so much for attending this session. Hopefully I give you a little break before the next one. We really appreciate you coming out, and I hope that you guys learned a ton from this session.
Thank you so much, Destiny. I'll give my little closing spiel now, but definitely hang around in case a few questions come in the last couple minutes here. So thank you, Destiny, and thank you, Benji, and thanks for everyone for attending. We hope you enjoyed this session. If you have any additional questions or would like to request slides or presentation materials, please email the Office of Disability Inclusion at odi@das.ohio.gov. We also invite you to share feedback on the session using the link provided in the chat. In the chat, we have a comment. A couple of practices that have worked for us, creating a DEI team that includes members, the chat just moved, that includes members from across the organization at all divisions and levels, and getting feedback from new hires on the recruitment and onboarding process and workplace inclusiveness. So interview panels, I think, that include people from across the organization and then seeking feedback about how the recruitment process went.
Emily, thanks so much for sharing. That's wonderful. And yeah, I definitely encourage everyone to do that. If you're able to, if you're in a position to get the feedback, that is such valuable information, and we definitely want to make sure that we're using it. I see we're dropping down there. My team will hang around to answer any questions or comments you want to throw in the chat. Again, thank you guys so much for joining our session today, and hopefully you learned a lot.
Thank you again for supporting Ohio's commitment to disability inclusion and DEI. We hope you enjoy the next session you attend, or if this was your last, hope you have a good rest of the day.